Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. The Man Without a Face. In the small town of Clearwater, amid dim streets and old buildings, stood an antique store. Inside, hundreds of mirrors, round, oval, ornate with gilded frames, and tiny pocket-sized ones. It was said that some of them reflected not only people but something else. Ellie found it by accident. She loved mirrors, fascinated by her own reflection. Mirrors were everywhere in her home. In the bathroom, in the bedroom, even in the kitchen. She adored watching herself from different angles. But that evening, when she bought an old-time darkened mirror with a thin, nearly imperceptible crack on the edge, she didn't yet know that it would change her life forever. That night, she dreamed she was standing before the mirror. It was no longer dusty, no longer cracked. It had become smooth, flawless, like the surface of black water. And there, in the darkness, something appeared. A figure. Tall, thin, all in black, without a visible face. It had no eyes, no mouth, no nose, but Ellie knew, it was staring at her. She woke up to a sharp sound. The mirror that had been hanging on the wall was now on the floor, even though no one had touched it. She felt a cold sweat on her back but convinced herself that it was just a coincidence. The next day, Ellie once again stared into the mirror. It seemed deeper, darker. When she leaned closer, her reflection lingered slightly, like it hadn't caught up with her movement. She blinked. Her reflection didn't. Something was wrong. That night, she saw the same dream again. The faceless figure stood even closer. She felt its breath, even though it had no mouth. Her own breath grew heavy, panicked. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. It tilted its head, as if studying her. Ellie woke up. She couldn't sleep anymore. She went to the mirror, but it no longer reflected her. It showed the room behind her, and something else. In the corner stood the same creature. She turned around. The room was empty. But when she looked back into the mirror, the figure was closer. Now she was sure. It was watching her. She remembered the words of the old antique dealer who had sold her the mirror. Mirrors hold on to what has stared into them for too long. That night, Ellie decided not to sleep. She turned on all the lights in the house. But the light couldn't stop the fear. She heard the mirror crack. And when she looked into it again, the room was gone. Only darkness. And the figure. Now it stood right in front of the glass. And then she left. Ellie's reflection disappeared. She could no longer see herself. She screamed, touched her face, but it wasn't reflected. Instead, in the mirror was her, but without a face. Ellie tried to run out of the room, but something grabbed her. The mirror was pulling her inside, like a black hole. She fought, but the fingerless hands pulled at her skin, her hair, her very soul. She felt the world around her blur. The next morning, the mirror stood in its place. Clean. Smooth. No crack. And Ellie no longer existed. But if someone looks into the mirror for too long, they will see her. She stands in the darkness, behind the glass. And sometimes, it seems that her faceless reflection raises a hand, ready to knock. The next morning, Kate, Ellie's neighbor, noticed that the windows of her house remained dark even at dawn. She called Ellie, but no one answered. Kate knew that Ellie had always been obsessed with mirrors. She had often joked that her friends spent more time in front of them than anyone else. But now, when Ellie wasn't answering her calls, Kate decided to visit her. The door was unlocked. An eerie silence filled the house. Everything looked as though Ellie had just stepped out for a moment. But when Kate entered the bedroom, a cold terror pierced her skin. On the wall hung a large mirror. It was wrong. The surface didn't reflect the light, didn't show the room. It was dark, almost black. Kate stepped closer. She looked into the mirror and saw her. Ellie. She stood there, in the darkness, behind the glass. Her face was gone. Smooth skin where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. She couldn't speak, couldn't scream, but Kate felt that her friend was silently begging for help. Kate screamed and stepped back. Then something shifted in the mirror. Ellie's reflection dissolved into the darkness. And in her place, another appeared. A tall, thin figure. It had no face, but Kate knew it was staring straight at her. The mirror shook, as if something was striking it from the inside. Kate rushed toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of her. Behind her, she heard a sound. Like something was crawling across the mirror's surface, scratching it from within. Kate froze. She was terrified to look back, but she could feel breath on the back of her neck. And then she saw it. The reflection in the mirror had changed. Now it showed Kate. But not the one standing here. In the mirror, her reflection slowly raised its hand, even though she herself remained motionless. Her reflection began to smile. Kate whimpered. Suddenly, the mirror started to crack. Thin lines spread across the glass, as if something from the other side was trying to break free. She ran toward the door, but it was too late. The mirror exploded. The shards didn't scatter. They hovered in the air, and in the center gaped a black hole, deeper than any darkness. From it emerged a hand. Long, pale, without fingers. It grabbed Kate by the throat and pulled her toward itself. She couldn't scream. The darkness consumed her. When everything fell silent, the mirror was whole again. Now there was no reflection of Kate in it. But if you get close enough, if you stare into the darkness, you'll see her. And she will be staring at you. People began to disappear in the town of Clearwater. First, Ellie. Then Kate. Their houses remained unlocked, their belongings in place, but the owners were nowhere to be found. The police couldn't find any signs of a struggle. No evidence of kidnapping. The only thing that connected all the cases was that in the rooms of the missing, there was always a large mirror. Jacob worked at a pawn shop and often bought antique items. That evening, he found a mirror on the doorstep of the shop. It was leaning against the door with no note, no signs of who might have left it. The frame was wooden, carved, but cracked. The glass looked old, but flawless. Jacob brought it inside, initially not paying much attention. But when he turned off the light before closing, he thought the mirror wasn't just reflecting the room. Something about it was off. He stepped closer. The reflection seemed normal, although darker than it should have been. Jacob ran his fingers across the glass, and shivered. It was warm. He quickly pulled his hand away. Funny, he thought. A mirror can't be warm. That night, Jacob slept restlessly. He woke up to the sound of someone whispering. The sound was distant, muffled, as if coming through water. He got up and went to the shop. The door was locked. But inside there was light. He slowly inserted the key into the lock and pushed the door open. The light was coming from the mirror. The glass emitted a strange, cold glow. The reflection of the shop was distorted, as if it were being flooded with ink. Jacob stopped. The reflection changed. Behind him, in the mirror, stood someone else. Tall, thin, wearing a long black coat. Jacob spun around. Nothing. He looked back into the mirror. The figure had moved closer. His breath caught in his throat. Now it was just a few centimeters away. He felt something behind him. Cold breath, the smell of dampness, like in abandoned houses. He couldn't move. His reflection suddenly began to change. The face disappeared. The skin became smooth, featureless. He opened his mouth to scream, but his mouth no longer reflected. And then something grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him inside. The next morning, the pawn shop door was open. Jacob was gone. And the mirror had become even darker. No one noticed how its reflection slowly smiled from within. Next was Sarah. She worked at a hotel on the outskirts of town. In one of the rooms stood a large antique mirror, which the owners couldn't remove. It was too heavy, too old. Sarah liked to check her hairstyle in it. But one day, she noticed something strange. When she stepped away from the mirror, her reflection stayed standing. It didn't move. She froze. Then the reflection raised its hand. Sarah recoiled. It started moving on its own. It took a step forward. The glass was no longer a barrier. It was coming out. Sarah screamed. The door to the room slammed shut by itself. And no one ever saw her again. Clearwater was gradually being engulfed by silence. People were disappearing. At first it was just a few, then dozens. The police tried to find any trace, any clue. but the only thing that connected them was that everyone had a mirror in their house. Panic began to spread throughout the town. Some people covered their mirrors with cloth. Others smashed them all together. But it didn't help. Even those who threw their mirrors away still vanished. Because the problem wasn't the mirrors. The problem was that they had looked into them for too long. Max worked at an auto repair shop. He didn't believe in all the mystical talk. But when his younger sister disappeared, he decided to learn more. In her room, there was only one mirror left. It looked ordinary, but when he stepped closer, he thought he saw it tremble slightly. He leaned in. His reflection mimicked all of his movements. He smiled at himself. Then, his reflection blinked. But he didn't. Max froze. His breath became heavy. The reflection no longer mirrored his movements. It slowly tilted its head. The reflection smiled wider. Too wide. And then its eyes disappeared. Black hollows remained where the eyes should have been. Max staggered back, but his legs froze. The reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. It exhaled. The glass began to crack with fine lines. And then Max heard a whisper. "It's too late. You've looked for too long." The mirror exploded. Max screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the darkness. The next morning, his friend Lauren found the door to his apartment open. Max was gone. Only the mirror remained intact. It looked older, covered in dust. And if you got close to it, you could see something behind the glass. Shadows. Movement. Hands, scratching from the inside. The faceless figure waited. It had always waited. It knew that people couldn't help but look into mirrors. And that sooner or later, someone would look for too long. And then, something would change. And no one would be able to tell who was real anymore. Lauren knew something was wrong. Max couldn't just disappear. But his phone was on the table. His keys were in the bowl by the door. All his things were in place. Only the mirror. It was wrong. Lauren could feel it on her skin. She stepped closer. She ran her fingers over the dusty surface. Cold. But when she pulled her hand away, a mark remained on the glass. As if someone on the other side had touched it too. She stepped back quickly. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Max." Her voice trembled. No answer. But the mirror began to darken. The surface grew blacker, deeper. Lauren saw her reflection. And it smiled. She wasn't smiling. Her heart pounded. The reflection took a step forward. She didn't move, but her reflection did. Lauren screamed and ran back. The reflection placed its hand on the glass. Then something began to form on its face. The eyes disappeared first. The mouth dissolved into smooth, faceless skin. And then it spoke. Without a mouth. Without lips. But she heard its voice directly in her mind. "You're next." The mirror cracked. Lauren rushed to the door and fled the apartment. She never returned. But the reflection didn't disappear. It stayed, waiting. The faceless figure had always waited. And if you look into the mirror for too long, it will look back at you. The faceless figure comes for those who gaze too long into mirrors. It waits. And when you stare into the darkness, it stares back. Now, tell me, how many mirrors are in your home? And when was the last time you checked if your reflection truly mimics every movement you make? And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.